All right. Good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Jamie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Weed-Free Seed, Unicorns, and Other Myths, presented by Steve Popovich, formerly with the U.S. Forest Service in Fort Collins and newly with the Bureau of Land Management National Office. Before I introduce our speaker, I will go over some webinar details. If you have questions or comments for the speaker or me, please type them into the questions window of your control panel located at the top right of your screen at any time during the webinar. I will field your questions for the speaker after the presentation. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio window and check your audio selections. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Steve Popovich is the new Emergency Stabilization and Rehabilitation National Program Lead with the BLM in Washington, D.C. He specializes in rehabilitation, use of native plant materials, and weed program management. He has about 30 years experience in natural resource management on federal public lands across the western U.S. He was formerly the forest botanist and invasive species program manager with the U.S. Forest Service on the Arapahoe and Roosevelt National Forests and Pawnee National Grassland in Colorado since 2002. He worked for the BLM in the 90s in southern Idaho as a botanist, where his position crosswalked closely with fire rehabilitation and treatment monitoring, and where he installed over 100 permanent fire rehab monitoring plots, some of which are still in place today. He also worked for the USGS as a research ecologist, studying altered wildfire cheatgrass fire cycles of the Intermountain West, disturbance to sagebrush steppe ecosystems, and effectiveness of wildfire rehabilitation treatments, including impacts of weeds. Steve has a passion for fighting the good fight when it comes to weeds. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you. It's glad to be here.
All right, now I will make you the presenter. Great.
All right, great. You can see the screen. We're ready to go. I'll launch right into it. It's a very convoluted and difficult topic to cover, weeds that occur in seed as contaminant in seed when you order seed or when you increase seed through a contractor. And there's a lot to it, so we're just going to kind of do the real down and dirty, fast, what you need to know, and introduce you to a tool that you may be using already, perhaps not. If not, it'll be new to you. If you're using it already, you might learn some new things as a way to further mitigate weeds that come as contaminants in seed that you order. You know, everybody loves unicorns. They're great, they're warm, they're friendly, they're cuddly, they have a lot of really neat values and positive energy around them. I particularly like the magic of a unicorn. For those of you who are in any kind of agency that does interdisciplinary teams and works on projects through an interdisciplinary team process, you can know that sometimes there's some conflicts in those teams, and unicorns are a great way to resolve conflict resolution. Unfortunately, of course, they're just a myth. And unfortunately, most of the time, so is truly weed-free seed. I'll just leave those up there for a minute for you to see, but look at that second bullet. Seed mixes containing listed noxious weeds can be legally sold as noxious weed seed free. And a little clue on the difference there is the terms listed noxious weeds versus noxious weed seed. So when we order our seed, we usually want to have that label that says noxious none on the seed label. Or we talk about seed ordering language in terms of certified weed-free seed, and then we pretty much consider that we're done, right? We move on. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I wish it were. When I talk about noxious none on a seed label, I'm talking about this area right here in the middle of the white label that says noxious weeds none found. This is a typical seed label, and every bag that you order has to have that label on it. And when you read that, you say, hey, there's no noxious weeds in the seed. We're good. I'm done. I would encourage you to read how to learn to understand a seed label, and it's on page 12 of the Seed Ordering Tips handout that is made available as an attachment as part of this webinar. Just to touch base a little bit on clarifying certified weed-free seed, there actually is no such thing as certified weed-free seed, although we often see it in our contract languages for rehabilitation or landscape resiliency work or whatever we do. There is such a thing as certified weed-free straw, and that's under a completely different program than we're talking about today. We'll talk about that one on April 5th. And that is an actual certification program by each state. But there's no certified weed-free seed program in place, which can sometimes be confused with what's called a certification letter that you get from seed companies when you order your seed. And I'll go over that a little bit later. There is, however, certified seed, and that refers to the quality of the seed and the genetic integrity of the seed. It has really nothing to do with the weed content in the seed. Two different things. And certified seed actually often is less weedy than non-certified seed because certified seed often comes with a higher tolerance level for cleanliness of the seed. There is seed that does truly have no weeds in it, but it's really, really rare. I've only seen it a handful of times in all my seed ordering I've done in 30 years, maybe 20 or 30 times out of 30 years where it's had absolutely no weeds in it. So let's jump right to a real-life example, and I'm going to try to minimize something here on my screen. Okay, this is a highway seeding that happened several years ago in response to a flood recovery effort, and it happened by a different government entity than the Forest Service. It was performed on National Forest System land on the forest that I administer, and it was for flood rehabilitation. So they used certified weed-free seed, which I just mentioned doesn't really exist, and they used about 1,100 pounds over 26 acres on a 7-mile highway corridor. So the Forest Service researched exactly what was in this seed because the certified weed-free seed kind of threw a flag up at us knowing that there really isn't such a thing. And what we found, using the tools that I will walk you through today, are 24 aggressive weeds were in that seed. That's a lot, including cheatgrass, and there are about 56,000 pounds, or 56,000 seeds of cheatgrass that hit this busy corridor along a stream. 3 of those species would be new records for Colorado if they were to germinate and persist. One of them was among the top 10 most economically damaging weeds to crops in the agricultural industry in Canada, which I don't want to have anything to do with introducing that kind of a scale of a problem. And by the way, cheatgrass costs wheat farmers in Colorado alone $350 million a year in control measures. So economically and environmentally, these kinds of species appearing in your weed seed are really important to understand. My favorite in that mix was something that's called Malta star thistle, which would be apparently new to Colorado or very, very few records in Colorado. 800 seeds hit the ground of that on this project. And all this seed was legally sold. No laws were broken. There wasn't any bad intent. There wasn't any offloading of seed or anything like that. But how can this be? Because the labels said noxious none. So this is how it can be. It's about the definitions that are used to define noxious, and it's about setting levels of weed occurrence in seed that meet acceptable standards to other people, but maybe don't meet acceptable standards to your level of weeds that would be tolerable for the seed that you're concerned about. There's also noxious weeds versus weeds, and noxious weeds have legal standing and are determined by the states. And the regulations in the seed industry only really apply to noxious weeds, not all the other weedy weeds or other aggressive plants that are out there. There's also a difference between weed lists and understanding the different kinds of weed lists, and that's really important to this webinar. There's noxious weeds, which are the green things that grow on the ground, and those lists are determined by the state. And there's noxious weed seed, and those are the things that are seed, and those lists are also determined at the state level. There are 2 different lists for a state, which is kind of confusing. Many states are going towards parity. Many states are trying to make It's so that if it's a noxious weed in that state, it's also automatically a noxious seed and vice versa. But a lot of states aren't there yet. I believe Kansas recently is. I know California is getting closer. Colorado is not there. They're quite different lists. So all these lists of noxious weeds and noxious weed seed differ by state. They're often not the same within a state. 50 states have 2 lists each. That's 100 lists right there. Plus there's a federal noxious weed list as well, which is some additional weeds that might not be on any of the other lists. It's a lot of lists, and I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by a lot of lists. So Kathy Carlock, I think you're on, and it's great to have you if you're watching, but you'll recognize this list. This is an actual list from a contract specification we used for the Mu King Bear Fire Rehabilitation in Northern California several years ago on the El Dorado National Forest. And I wrote this list. It made it into the appendices as saying, hey, contractors, you can't have any of the following weeds or weed seed in any of the materials that we're using. So you see a California noxious weeds list at the top, and you can see there's a lot of plants on that list, a lot of scientific names. Then there's a California noxious weed seed list, which is quite a bit shorter. There's 2 kinds of categories of noxious weed seed. There's a prohibited category and a restricted category, and I'll explain that later. Then there's the federal noxious weed list, and that tiers to the Federal Plant Protection Act, and they break their noxious weeds into sort of like habitats or functional groups. They have aquatic weeds, parasitic weeds, terrestrial weeds, a lot of them. And then if you take those lists just for California and the federal list and combine them, you get this sort of master list, which the contractor had to tier to. And this master list is a whole lot of plants. If there's an asterisk, it means that that plant appears on more than one of the lists. And if you scroll through here, you'll see that not a lot of plants have asterisks by them. So a lot of these plants only appear on one list or another list, but not both. So this is really hard to get a handle on, and I don't like it. It's confusing, it's over our heads, no one knows all these plants. So what can you do to help yourself with getting through this? So one of the biggest constraints and misconceptions when you order seed is that the law in the seed industry only prohibits noxious weed seed, not noxious weeds. So part of that explanation of why noxious weeds can actually be in your seed and it can say noxious none is because it doesn't reject for the presence of noxious weeds, only for noxious weed seed. And as you know, they're different lists. Some noxious weed seed is even allowable for sale up to certain threshold amounts. And it's kind of like, you know, a little bit's okay. And you're thinking, huh? A little bit's okay? Kind of like a small fire is okay, it won't become a big fire. A little bit of cheatgrass is okay, it won't become a lot of cheatgrass. You're thinking, whoa, I don't understand this. So those are those 2 categories of seed. Prohibited seed, you can't sell any of that. If your label ever says it has a prohibited seed on it, there's something probably happening that's not supposed to happen. You probably will never see that. Then restricted seed, which can have some limited amounts, and those restrictions are set by each state. For example, in Colorado, you can have some cheatgrass. Well, that's not a good example. In some states, you can have some really bad weeds that are sold up to a certain threshold amount, 10 viable seeds per pound or 20 viable seeds per pound. Also, these lists of weed seed are relatively small, generally speaking, compared to the weeds of concern to you on your unit or your local area. They just don't seem to capture what you want them to capture. So the key concept is that noxious seed exams, which is one of the tools we're going to look at in a minute here, only test, it's the thing that is tested to give you the reading on the plant label that says noxious none. It comes from something called a noxious seed exam. And the noxious seed exams only test for noxious weed seed, not noxious weeds or other weeds. You can sell seed not containing, you can't sell seed not con you can sell seed not containing prohibited noxious weed seed. You can sell seed containing some amounts of restricted noxious weed, but of course, to me, for our ecological integrity and economic damage reasons, the correct threshold of any kind of restricted noxious weed seed should be 0. So you look at that bottom there, those kinds of species, the ones that we often care about as land managers in the West, especially in the Intermountain West or the Great Basin, cheatgrass, kochia, Russian thistle, some of those things, knapweeds, Sisler milkvetch, smooth brome is often aggressive when it's in a natural setting. Maybe it's okay for the roadside, but maybe not in a wilderness area. And all kinds, thousands really, of other weedy species can be legally present in the seed and can be sold legally because they're not noxious weed seed. So you're starting to get a pretty good idea of how this can happen. So for cheatgrass, since it's not a listed noxious weed seed in any of the 50 states, it is a listed noxious weed in some states, including Colorado. It's a list C noxious weed in Colorado. Because of that, you can theoretically buy a bag of 100% cheatgrass and it can be legally sold. You didn't break a law, they didn't break a law. Just want to go over kind of the concept that we're all pretty well aware of, that a few weeds in seed can mean a lot of weeds on the landscape. So again, an example of cheatgrass, because a lot of us are familiar with that particular species. If you have 0.01% cheatgrass in seed, that can be, let's just say 10 cheatgrass seeds per pound. I've seen up to 600 seeds per pound in a bag. That was still 0.01% cheatgrass. If we carry it through that scenario and we seed 5 pounds per acre with 10 seeds per pound, we'll produce 13,000 seeds by the end of the fall of the first year. This is assuming optimal growing conditions for cheatgrass and that everything germinates and everything sets seed. By the end of the second year, assuming a really good year for cheatgrass, you could have up to 3.1 million seeds per acre by that year. That's kind of game over. And that's, should get your ears up a little bit. So let's just kind of remind ourselves of what this looks like. That's game over. And look at that upper left picture, 10 years after seeding with seed containing cheatgrass. That cheatgrass may have only been 20 seeds per pound, let's say. So we're definitely stepping on our own feet if we kind of do this stuff. So an example with cheatgrass again is to just read through the following, and let's say that in your haste you're in an emergency rehabilitation situation, or due to budget capacity you can't pay for premium seed, or you learned of the project late in the game and you need to fix something really fast. Whatever your reason is, you go ahead and you accept some seed that's containing quote-unquote a little bit of cheatgrass, and you put it into an area that doesn't have any right now. And the reason you want to do it is to obtain soil stability. And that soil stability with the seed mix from all the other desirable target species in that mix is achieved in the first 2 growing seasons after seeding. Great. But 7 years later you come back and that site is dominated by the cheatgrass that has outcompeted the very native seed bank and the very native seeds you ordered. And that cheatgrass is no longer providing soil site stability, sort of countering the goal for which you seeded. You lost pollinator-friendly herbs, you lost plant diversity, you lost your native seed bank, you lost wildlife habitat, it's converted to an annual cheatgrass rangeland, kind of game over. So was the original goal of soil stability ultimately achieved? I'd say it wasn't really, not when it goes back to cheatgrass, which doesn't really hold soil in place all that much compared to perennial bunch grasses and shrubs and forbs and things like that. And was the long-term cost outweighed by the short-term benefit? That's why this stuff really matters. So then you think to yourself, well, how much seed is okay? Is a little bit okay? And that's up to you, of course, and that depends on a lot of different kinds of information to assess. What's the weediness of that seed? What's the threat to the ecosystem? How aggressive is it or benign to your ecosystem? Not all weeds are bad to your ecosystem. Some of them might even give a short-term crop benefit and then fade away over 3 or 4 years and provide some initial benefit as the other plants that you really want in the system are establishing through time at a slower pace. How much of it is there? 0, of course, is always what you want. And then maybe perhaps some of the political or legality issues that come with letting seed hit the ground that has seed in it that's actually a noxious weed. So if we're say in Colorado, The State Weed Act implies that if a noxious weed, like cheatgrass in Colorado, is knowingly seeded, if you know that there's a little bit of cheatgrass in that seed, but you used it anyway, you're technically out of compliance with the Act, because the Act says if you knowingly plant noxious weeds, which is cheatgrass, the second it grows, the second it germinates, you've violated the Act. So there's that little bit of legal ramification to think about as well. When you reject weedy seed, some of the things that you would evaluate it upon are things like the degree of invasiveness, which we just discussed, the threat to the ecosystem and the economy from kind of spilling over into farmers' crops. A lot of times what will happen is things will spill over into the wash downstream, and they'll spill over into downstream farmers' crops or irrigated water. The risk of establishment in your project area and the ability to mitigate persistence. If you do have some weeds coming up from the seed, can you treat it? Can you access it? Are the slopes too steep to treat? Do you have the staff and capacity to treat? So the whole purpose of this webinar is to introduce you to a tool that is the single best thing that you can do to mitigate this yikes, and some of you are probably already doing it. And that's to use seed test analyses that are available by the vendor. The vendor must keep those on file, and to also test your seed and to give interpretation to the seed test analyses. It's really the only way you know what seeds you're really ordering and if you're getting what you paid for. You can't really rely on the noxious none. That's kind of out the window these days. It's a good starting point, but there's a lot more to it than that. This tool is readily available to you. It's usually not really used a lot by you guys or all of us, and it's something that I think we should be using fully. We should take advantage of a free, easy to use, readily accessible tool. So the take-home message is the single most important thing you can do when ordering seed is to check the PLS and the weed content. We're not going to focus on pure live seed today. We're going to just talk about the weed content part about ordering seed. Review seed test results, and you can start doing that as soon as we get off the phone. If this is new to you and you've never done it before, it's really easy. So this is how you do it when you're ordering your seed before you buy it, before you commit to your seed. For each lot, so-called lot of seed that you want to order, you ask the vendor to send you both the purity and the noxious weed exam lab results, and they'll fax them to you. The purity assesses the species that you ordered, the target species, like I want some western wheatgrass, and it's kind of a smaller sample. The noxious weed test assesses listed noxious weed seed and is a larger sample. But the weeds may show up in both of those test results. So these two test results will list all the weeds encountered in that test, which is all the weeds that theoretically could be present in the seed that will be ordered to you. They identify the species to the species level when they can, sometimes they can't, and they search for all weeds when they're doing these tests, not just noxious weeds, not just listed weeds, not just this or that or the other list. If it's a weed and it's something that we don't like and it's kind of aggressive and it's recognized as just a regular old weed, they look for it. So when you get a seed lab analysis, you want to look at those three report sections of the seed lab analysis called noxious, weed, and crop. So let's do that. So here's a lab analysis that they can fax to you. In this case, the seed is Rudbeckia hirta, which is like a black-eyed Susan forb in the composite family. And there's three categories: crop, weed, and noxious. Just look at those three categories and see what weeds are in there. In noxious, I see a thistle, a star thistle. In common weeds, I see a whole bunch of stuff. Some of it might be of concern to me, especially this lepidium, which is pepperweed, lepidium species. They couldn't tell which species it is. Under other crop seeds, I see some more weeds. This crop category is where things like smooth brome and Cicer milkvetch will show up. Those are things that are still grown as crops today. You can still buy sweet clover, Cicer milkvetch, prostrate kochia, those kinds of things. We still use them occasionally. A lot of agencies still use them for roadside seedings, those kinds of things. And if those are in the seed mix that you want and you're getting, say, a native bunch grass, things like smooth brome and kochia will show up, or smooth brome and prostrate kochia will show up under crops. Things that are regular weeds that don't have a listing status will show up under common. And things that are noxious weed seed, it just doesn't say the word seed there, will show up under here. Here's another one. So can you find the hidden weeds? Again, check, just focus on those 3 categories. Don't worry about all the numbers and all the other stuff. Look in crop, right here, other crop. Look in weed, sometimes called common weed, right here. I see cheatgrass. I see meadow salsify. And look in noxious weed, right here. It says none found for noxious weed seed. So in that first example, there was 135 seeds of Malta star thistle. These are actually the real seed tests and analyses that we looked into when we looked at that example I gave you about the flood recovery seeding. These are the actual data from that. So go back up here, and right here is Malta star thistle, 135 viable seeds per pound of that plant. I would reject it. Then I see chamomile and lepidium. What if that lepidium is perennial pepperweed? That's a big no-no in the Intermountain West for sure. I don't want to chance it. I don't know if it's really that or not, but I'm not going to chance it, so I'm going to reject. And that's right here. Lepidium is the pepperweed and Themis is the chamomile. So because of those, even though they're not listed weed seed, I'm rejecting. In example 2, there was 45 viable seeds per pound of cheatgrass. That's not good to me. I'm going to reject. There's also some meadow salsify. That might not be a big enough problem in my world and my ecosystems that I managed to worry about, so maybe that's benign and I'm not going to worry about it. And those 2 are right here. 45 viable seeds per pound of each. So you just reviewed 2 examples of real seed lab tests to determine what weeds they encountered, even though the seed labels said noxious none. It's that easy. A vendor doesn't have to share that data with you or the lab test with you. It's not required. It's not really even an industry standard. I think it should be, but it's not. But if they don't want to share those with you, you have the right to know exactly what you are buying, all the contents within what you're buying, and you can seek business elsewhere. Seed industry would like to have your business, and they would like you to be a satisfied customer, and they'd like you to come back and order more from them, and they care about the environment just like as we all do. So they want to do good things and want to work with you. But if they're not going to show you that seed lab analysis for the seed that you're ordering, perhaps there's a reason why they don't want to share that, and it might be better to just walk away and use a different vendor. If you want to test your own seed, say after you purchased it, there's ways to do that. We're not going to go into how you sample that seed, but it's kind of important how you rip open the bag and pull a sample. But you would request a seed lab to test purity for your seed and do a noxious weed exam. And the types of noxious weed exams that you most frequently would request is something called an all states noxious exam, which tests for all listed weed seed in all 50 states, usually not counting Hawaii, because we're not in Hawaii and stuff that's in Hawaii is probably not going to be a problem with us. Or a Western states noxious exam, which tests for noxious weed seed in the Western states, which might, if you're in the West, that might be what you want to do. Or you can test just for the state that you reside in. Some of the tricks that happen is they'll test seed only for the state that they're selling the seed in or where they're headquartered. If my company is in Washington, I'll do a test only for Washington state listed weed seed, not for Colorado, not for Idaho. So if you request a Western states, when you test your seed, you can request any Western state you want, and you should specify the states that you want. It's just easiest to test for all states. Then you got it all. If you're in the East Coast and you're listening today, you can test for Maryland or Maine or whatever state you'd like. And then a really good way to test is to order a bulk exam for weed and crop, and that is good because it tests a larger portion of your submitted sample for all the weed seeds and crop seeds, regardless of whether they're noxious or have a legal status or not. And without getting into all the reasons of why this is all the way it is, if you want to test the most seed when you submit a sample, so you have the volume there to catch the most seed presence, you can request a bulk exam, or you can ask that all your weeds that you're concerned about be tested with the noxious weed exam. And you can rush that, and they're pretty cheap. So again, the single most important thing to do to sort of head off the yikes and not even let it hit the ground and not even let it get out of the warehouse is to check that weed content. And you just saw 2 examples of how to do that, and I'm going to review a couple more right now that are not available after the webinar. So this is the actual seed lab results from that flood recovery exercise. And this is a so-called letter of certification, which can be confused with certified weed-free seed. This isn't certified that it's weed-free. It's not certifying anything like that. It's just certifying from the vendor that says, hey, you ordered seed from me. Here's all the seed you ordered. Here's the specifications of the seed. And I certify that what the label says it has in it, it really does have in it, and that these labels are correct and true. That's what that letter of certification is, not what weeds it particularly has or doesn't have. So you see all kinds of different seed lots here, and you see all kinds of numbers here, and we're just going to skip through this and go right to some of the seed lab analyses for each of those seed lots. This is just, again, what some Morgan oats looks like, and here there's a problem because it's kind of hard to understand what it really means. And it doesn't tell you much. It's really just talking about the purity of the test. It's only, right here it's called a germination test, and it's really not testing for noxious weeds or common weeds or other crops. It's really only testing for germination. So just because it says 0 there doesn't mean much because they didn't really test for it. It's kind of deceiving. Here's another test from Montana State University lab, and I can see other crop. There's some wheat, probably not concerned to me. Noxious weed seeds, it's only tested for the state of Montana. It says states, Montana. They tested 1,000 grams. That's really, really good. I like that. The more seed they test, the more opportunity to find stuff that's in the seed. They didn't find anything, none found. And under normal common weeds, none found. So I'm happy with this. This is for Bouteloua gracilis, and you can see that noxious weeds, none. Common weeds, oh, they found some pigweed and some bessia. Those might be of concern to me. I have to kind of translate what that means into scientific names. I don't like common names because it means so many things, but no crop weeds, nothing like Cicer milkvetch or smooth brome, yellow sweet clover. This one might be okay. It depends on the pigweed or the bessia if those are a concern to me or not. Here's another one from NST Labs, which is used quite frequently, noxious weeds. They did an all states noxious for all 50 states. That's great. And the problem here that I don't like is it's not requested. So they didn't really test. So weed seeds not requested. Noxious weeds not requested. Special noxious weeds not requested. So what does this really mean? Not much to me. Here they found noxious weed seeds in the western states exam. They tested 70 grams worth of seed, and they found Lolium persicum, which is a really bad grass for the egg industry. It's noxious as a weed in Montana, Texas, and Canada. And they found 6 viable seeds per pound, but that's enough for me to not get anywhere near it. That's the one that's the top 10 in the industry for threats to Canada's egg industry. I'm not going to touch that. I'm going to skip this one. Skip this one. Here I found in a weed seed some kind of a rat tail fescue. It's pretty aggressive in riparian areas. If it's an aggressive weed, but it's not listed, and if it were to persist in Colorado, it might be new to the state of Colorado, so I don't really want to introduce that. 2,800 seeds per pound, that's a lot. This shows all kinds of issues. I see sweet clover, I see brassica, I see smut, I see sonchus, spiny annual thistle. I don't want any of that stuff. Here's one that we looked at earlier that has downy brome at 45 viable seeds per pound. It also has noxious weed exam none, but they only tested for the state of Washington. That's a very small subset. Here's one to alert you to the fact that they only tested the seed for weeds in 2 grams. That's not very much. You saw another one that was 70 grams, another one was 100 grams. I like to see 70 grams or more. 2 grams is not a very good chance to find anything bad in that low sample amount. And here I just wanted to point out weedy seed, downy brome or cheatgrass, 731 seeds per pound. Noxious weeds, none. States tested, Western states, 12 grams used. This is a deal breaker for me. I'm not going to go through chain of custody, but I left these slides on here. I threw them in just for you to look at later another time. Just some tips on chain of custody, some tips on shipping and storage, some tips on shelf life, tips on seed mixing. There's a seed ordering tips that's available. It walks you through a lot of this. It has a lot more information than what I covered. But kind of the take-home message is relying on the seed label, noxious none is not enough. It's just not enough to know what you're really buying. It's often misinterpreted to mean that there are no weeds in the seed, and that is definitely not the case. Most seed has weeds in it or undesirable crop, like, say, sweet clover or smooth brome. It's just a matter of which species and how much. Some may be harmful, some may be benign. Weed lists differ. There's a difference between weed seed lists and weed lists, and they differ by state. Seed is only rejected if it contains listed noxious weed seed, not weeds. And on top of that, there's a caveat that some of the listed weed seed can be sold if it's a restricted category and it's within the restricted amounts. So what you can do starting tomorrow is prepare that list in advance of the weeds to prohibit in your contract or when you're picking up the phone and ordering seed. Regardless if it's listed or if it's on all those numerous lists, who cares? It needs to be of concern to you. So it's what you want to avoid in the seed that counts. Let the vendor know that that's what you're not going to be willing to accept. And insist that the vendor provide the copies of the seed lab analysis for both purity and noxious weeds for each seed lot prior to your purchase. And then once you get your hands on those, just simply read through those 3 categories, crop, weed, and noxious weed, and that's where the weeds of concern to you will show up in any one of those 3 sections. Make sure that the list meets your local needs and review the seed lab analyses for every lot of every species that you consider acquiring. And it's really good to do this before you purchase or make a commitment. It's really hard to return seed you don't want after you've already purchased it. It's also good to do this before the seed is mixed. Sometimes you'll want to order a mixture, a special mixture for your purposes, and it might be 5 different things. And the seed company will mix that for you and ship it to you pre-mixed, which is often advantageous to you. It saves you time and so on. But once you mix it and it becomes a special seed mix, it's really hard for the company to want to take that back. They can't undo the mix and restock the shelves with that seed anymore. It's yours. So you have to be really careful to have a clear in-written agreement up front to say, these are my weed tolerance expectations. These are what I will not accept. And I need to review these before I commit to you mixing that seed and me purchasing it. Also, it's worthwhile to do a little bit of market research and determine if alternate mixes are around that can be used that don't contain the weeds of concern. Oftentimes, there's different lots of a species. Say there's 20 different fields of western wheatgrass grown in Canada, and one of those fields might have some cheatgrass in it, but the other fields might not. One might have sweet clover, but the others might not. And sometimes the vendor can do his homework and work with his wholesalers and his suppliers and track down some lots that don't have the species of concern in them to you, and then you can go ahead and he can order those for you and you can buy those lots. So that's the one tool that is underutilized and underappreciated and very easy to use and accessible to you immediately that I would strongly endorse that you start doing routinely and getting into your contract specs and just as a routine way of doing business and just keep this kind of growing elephant more at bay. So that's all I had, and I'll now ask if there's any questions. But I think before I do, Janie, you're gonna take over and maybe try to do those videos.
Yeah, so we have a couple videos. They're a little older, so they're grainy, and go to webinar is still in like the testing phase of these videos, but we tested them yesterday and they worked, so hopefully they will work for you too.
And can you hear me, Janie? Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
Uh-huh.
So the first one is kind of how we're doing business now, which is we buy seed with weed in it. We pay the consequences later to our poor weed staff and to our land base, and we try to do the impossible by trying to mitigate the weeds once they're there. And let's go ahead and show that video about what our superhuman feats of mitigation kind of look like.
Okay.
So that's what we do. You know, that's us trying to mitigate weeds. We're trying to be the park ranger that's running ahead of the cheetah there. So the second video is where we want to get to. And one of the tools that you can use in your tool set today that we talked about, looking at seed lab analyses, helps us get to where we use less energy, we think smarter, and we try not to let that seed even hit the ground. So go ahead and try that video. So we want to get to be doing business smarter, and this is one of the tools you now have available to you, and you are more empowered. So with that, let's go to questions.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, those videos are fake.
Oh yes, no, there were no animals harmed in the making of those videos.
Right. Does anyone have any questions for Steve? Steve, when you said earlier that the tests asking your contractors or the people you purchase from to give you the results of those tests or running them yourself and they were pretty cheap, what do you mean by pretty cheap?
I mean anywhere from about $25 to upwards of $100, possibly up to $200 depending on what they find in the seed, how long it takes them. They start to charge by the hour if they find a lot of really dirty seed with a lot of seeds, weed seed in it. But basically, I would say between $25 and $70 per seed lot is pretty routine, on the lower end even.
Okay, great. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions.
I will tell you over the phone, I didn't want to put the contacts up there, but I will mail Jamie a contact sheet that can be downloaded as attachments, but just verbally, some of the good contacts to learn more about this, or if you have any questions about what I talked about or want to know more details. Randy Crowell is a good contact. He's a seed analyst, and he's actually the president of the American Association of Seed Analysts, who regulate all the rules I was just telling you about. In Fort Collins at a seed lab here, he's a great person to seek more information about this kind of world. Victor Vankus is the U.S. Forest Service National Seed Lab person in Georgia, and he will be happy to help Forest Service staff with more questions. And then you can always contact me, and I'll help whomever calls me. We're all in this together. We all want no bad things to happen on the landscape. We're all fighting the same cause. So I am very happy to walk you through more details or specific testing language requests, or maybe some contract specification language, which I'm not going to make available publicly, but I can work with you on examples of contract language to put in your IDIQs or whatever, or any questions relating to any of this. I'll be happy to go into the weeds, so to speak, with you on it. And by the way, we'll have a similar seminar on April 5th on weed contaminant in mulch, which is the same kind of paradigm. There's a lot more weed in mulch than you think, and when it's certified weed-free mulch, it really is definitely not weed-free. It's a question of degree and species and similar sort of program constraints and different lists. So if you want to apply the same sort of concepts to how to inspect and how to test for straw for mulching, please join us on April 5th.
Yeah, and I'll send that registration link out. I imagine for most people who attended this webinar probably also saw the registration link for that one, but I'll send it in the GoToWebinar automatic follow-up tomorrow. I'll add that link for any of you who haven't heard about that. All right, well, thank you all for your participation, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that will appear after the webinar has ended. I will post the recording of this video on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel this afternoon, and the link will be automatically sent to you through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. And also, just to let you know, the handouts that were provided, the 4 handouts, and the contacts list that Steve's going to send me, I'll post those on our Great Basin Fire Science Exchange website as well. So if you have further questions regarding this or future webinars, please email or call me anytime. Again, thank you for attending, everyone, and thank you so much, Steve, for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.
All right, have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.